Hey guys, it's the Armed Educator here. Today we're going to be talking about the Second Amendment. My entire channel is about the Second Amendment, but today we're going to discuss the meaning of the amendment that somehow is one of the most hotly contested parts of it. And by hotly contested, I mean that one side stands in complete honest truth and the other does mental gymnastics to prove their point. You might have heard anti-gun activists say something along the lines of, the Second Amendment is a collective right, or the Second Amendment only applies if you're part of a well-regulated militia. There even is the famous Warren Burger quote about the modern interpretation being a complete fraud. Anti-gunners love to quote that, while ignoring some of Burger's other quotes.
Oh, well, isn't that convenient?
I've got a little secret for you. They're all wrong. Even Warren Burger is wrong. And I can prove it. I'm going to be doing a two-part video discussing the various historical documents that put these criticisms to shame. So today, come on a journey with me as we uncover the historical evidence for the individual right theory. Today I'm going to be referring to an article from the Reload called Analysis. Historical texts show individual right to keep and bear arms isn't an NRA invention. In this fantastic article by Kostas Moros and Stephen Gutowski, the pair presents several historical documents from the 19th and early 20th century that either confirm or allude to an individual right. I'm not going to be reading quotes from the article itself, but I will be reviewing the documents that were linked in the article and try to elaborate on the background of each document. I'm a bit of a history nerd, especially in regards to anything Second Amendment related. If you guys want to follow along with me in the article, the link to it can be found down below in the description. The first document that we will look at is called Statistical Annals, Embracing Views of the Population, Commerce, Navigation, Fisheries, Public Lands, Post Offices, Establishment, Revenues, Mint, Military Naval Establishments, Expenditures, Public Debt, and Sinking Fund of the United States of America. Holy crap, that is a mouthful. This book was written by Dr. Adam Sabert, who represented Pennsylvania in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1809 to 1815. He also became a member of the American Philosophical Society in 1797. The society itself was founded in 1743 and had major influence over political thought in the Revolutionary era. Dr. Sabert wrote this book in 1818, 3 years after leaving Congress. The book should be seen as a compendium of statistics, charts, and graphs with occasional commentaries that represent the demographic makeup of the country at the time. On page 633 of his book, Dr. Sabert says, "Our Constitution guarantees to every citizen the right to keep and bear arms, while in other countries this very important trust is controlled by the caprice and tyranny of an individual." I don't really think I need to explain this one, but I will. Mostly for the mental gymnastics crowd. There are two important phrases: guarantees to every citizen and caprice and tyranny of the individual. If the Second Amendment guarantees the right to every citizen to keep and bear arms, one could easily conclude that this was always interpreted as an individual right. Every individual citizen has the right to arms. No conditions involved. Caprice and tyranny of the individual is a rather interesting phrase that seems to suggest that only tyrants would have an interest in controlling the people's ability to keep and bear arms.
For those brave right-wing Americans who say it's all about keeping America's independent and safe, if you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something a little more than a gun.
The next document we look at is an interesting one. A treatise on the unconstitutionality of American slavery, together with the powers and duties of the federal government in relation to that subject. These people really love their long titles, don't they? This fine piece of work by Joel Tiffany was written in 1850. Tiffany was a practicing lawyer in Ohio and was a staunch abolitionist. In his book, as the title implies, Tiffany deconstructs the idea that slavery could ever be supported constitutionally. In his book, he writes that the right to keep and bear arms is accorded to every subject for the purpose of protecting and defending himself, if need be, in the enjoyment of his absolute rights to life, liberty, and property. And this guarantee is to all, without any exception, for there is none, either expressed or implied. So the next time someone suggests that Scalia made up the right to self-defense in the Heller decision, just show them that quote. Every subject is granted this right. It helps him protect and secure his rights to life, liberty, and property. That's why so many pro-2A advocates say that your Second Amendment rights protect all of your other rights. Tiffany wasn't the only abolitionist who had views on the right to keep and bear arms. One of my favorite libertarian political philosophers, Lysander Spooner, also wrote his own treatise on why slavery was unconstitutional. aptly named The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. Finally, a short title. Now, Spooner may look like a creepy Santa Claus, but he was a revolutionary political thinker who reached notoriety when he wrote his book. Spooner was a constitutional textualist, which meant that he believed that the Constitution should be interpreted according to the plain text, not the private intention of the author. He goes at length how many of the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights were being denied to slaves, namely the Second Amendment. Spooner says that the Second Amendment obviously recognizes the natural right of all men to keep and bear arms for their personal defense, and prohibit both Congress and state governments from infringing on the right of the people, that is, any of the people, to do so. Notice there another mention of a right to keep and bear arms in relation to self-defense. I also like how he asserts that the Second Amendment is incorporated to the states before the 14th Amendment was even proposed, or it was officially incorporated in 2010 with McDonald v. Chicago. I'll talk more about what that means later. The article has one more abolitionist commenting on the Second Amendment, Horace Greeley. He was the founder of the New York Tribune and spoke out quite a bit in regards to the abolition of slavery. Greeley gave a speech to an all-black church in Richmond, Virginia in 1867, a year after the 14th Amendment was ratified. In his speech, he spoke about the fight to abolish slavery and how far they had come. He also took time to discuss what their rights were now that they had equal protection under the law. He says, "Our federal Constitution gives the right to the people everywhere to keep and bear arms, and every law whereby any state legislature undertakes to contravene this, being in conflict with the Constitution of the United States, had no longer any legal force." First, we see the mention of everyone everywhere having this right, but the conclusion to this quote is rather interesting. Obviously, Greeley had read Marbury versus Madison, and John Marshall's quote, "A law repugnant to the Constitution is void." He is suggesting that any restriction on the right to keep and bear arms is unconstitutional and therefore should be ignored since it doesn't have the authority of the Constitution backing it up. So here we see three separate abolitionists all saying that everyone, and I mean everyone, has the right to keep and bear arms. Just remember that if anyone makes the hilariously bad statement that the Second Amendment protected slave patrols, it's disingenuous and factually incorrect. The next document we will look at comes from William Rawle. Rawle was a practicing lawyer in Pennsylvania who was appointed by George Washington himself to be the U.S. District Attorney for Pennsylvania in 1791. He even prosecuted the members of the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. While he was serving as Pennsylvania's DA, he wrote A View of the Constitution of the United States in 1825. This book went through the entirety of the Constitution and explained the meaning and reasoning for every provision. Of course, if one is to understand the great mystery of the Constitution, one must look at all of its aspects, including the Second Amendment. Rawle is rather explicit in his interpretation of the amendment. No clause in the Constitution could, by any rule of construction, be conceived to give Congress a power to disarm the people. Such a litigious attempt could only be made under some general pretense by a state legislature. But in any blind pursuit of inordinate power, either should attempt it, this amendment may be appealed to as a restraint on both. Yes, you heard that right. A first-generation American says the Second Amendment prohibits disarmament. Just what do you think the Founding Fathers, especially Rawle, would think of bans on any types of arms? Now, you might have caught a troubling portion of the quote. However, Rawle seems to suggest the state does have the right to infringe on the Second Amendment rights of the people in their states. But I want you guys to keep in mind that this book was written before the 14th Amendment, which legally incorporated every right in the Constitution to the states. In 1876, we had a rather explicit statement in U.S. v. Cruikshank. The First and Second Amendments included rights were untouchable by the federal government, but they also agreed that it could be restricted by state governments. However, starting in the 1890s, we start to see a rejection of this logic, creating the incorporation doctrine. I plan on doing a whole video about incorporation in relation to the Second Amendment, but for now, I'll give a short rundown. Incorporation doctrine is the constitutional philosophy that the rights described in the Bill of Rights were made applicable to all the states with the passage of the 14th Amendment. After all, every citizen now has equal protection under the laws. If the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, it stands to reason that the people of the several states are also subject to the laws of the Constitution. Thus, the states can't restrict your constitutional rights either. It took some time, but eventually the Supreme Court started to apply incorporation doctrine to the rights found in the Bill of Rights. Sadly, the second wasn't formally incorporated until 2010 in McDonald v. Chicago, as I mentioned earlier. Later on in the same book, William Rawle mentions that the only time you could punish someone for carrying arms were circumstances giving just reason to fear that he purposes to make an unlawful use of them. This mention of unlawful use is interesting, After all, Scalia mentions in the famous Heller opinion that the Second Amendment protects arms that are commonly used for lawful purposes. History doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes. The next document comes from Clement Laird Van Landingham, a man who represented Ohio in the House of Representatives from 1858 to 1863. Now, I'm going to have to set up some historical context for this one, so bear with me. During the Civil War, the federal government began to take control of guns all over the North. Guns were pulled from the shelves along with powder and ammunition. All these arms were then given to the Union Army to assist the war effort. This pissed a lot of people off, including Van Landingham. So he decided to give a famous speech in Congress, stating, "Sir, the constitutional right to keep and bear arms carries with it the right to buy and sell arms, and firearms are useless without powder, lead, and percussion caps. It is our right to have them." Van Landingham makes a point to draw the connection between the explicit right in the Constitution and the implied right to buy and sell firearms. How can you have the right to keep and bear arms if you can't buy them in the first place? Another point of note here is that he mentions that powder, lead, and percussion caps are also covered by the Second Amendment. All are analogous to the bullets and casings that we have today, and yet we still have anti-gunners who parrot the phrase, "Ammo isn't covered by the 2A. They should be laughed out of any discussion about guns. The final document that I will discuss today comes from Thomas Cooley. Pretty much the entirety of Cooley's life was spent studying law. When he wasn't doing that, he was probably criticizing slavery. In 1880, Cooley wrote a book called The General Principles of Constitutional Law in the United States of America. Similar to William Rawle, Cooley's book sought to explain the provisions of the Constitution. This time, it was his generation's turn to interpret what the Second Amendment actually means. Now, there were 3 editions of this book, and the quote that I bring to you comes from the third, which was published in 1898. In the book, he straight up refutes the militia right theory that is so prevalent today. He says, "It may be supposed from the phraseology of this provision that the right to keep and bear arms was only granted to the militia, but this would be an interpretation not warranted by the intent. The meaning of the provision undoubtedly is that the people, from whom the militia must be taken, shall have the right to keep and bear arms, and they need no permission or regulation of law for the purpose." Cooley was probably one of the top authorities of constitutional law at the time. Nobody claimed to understand the Constitution better than him. His stances on the Constitution were accepted as gospel. The fact that anyone still pushes the militia right theory just shows that they are either completely disingenuous or intellectually bankrupt, or maybe both. The truth is that the individual right theory isn't so much of a theory, so much as it is the true meaning of the text. Well guys, I hope you all enjoyed the Geek Out session with me. I had a lot of fun not only reading the article by Morris and Gutowski, but also reading the primary sources that they provided. I will be sure to leave a link in the article in the description. Please check it out. It's a fantastic read. I plan on doing a second video that finishes up the remaining documents discussed in this article. If you guys want to catch that video, be sure to subscribe. And while you're at it, leave a like and comment which source you found to be the most interesting. Until next time, remember to stay armed and stay educated. Thanks.